listener production.
Hey, welcome to The Briefing. I'm Sasha Barbagat. You might have heard the phrase deep state in the news about Donald Trump recently. He's promised to dismantle it. But what exactly is the deep state? And do we have one in Australia?
We all have an interest that public policy has been conducted sensibly, safely, by the book, by the rules. But there are some things which necessarily can't be made fully transparent at all times.
The shadowy world of the deep state conspiracy theory and what stops Australia's government being undermined from the inside is coming up in the second half of this episode. But first, it is time for the headlines with Chris Spiru on Thursday, December 5.
Morning, Sash. Morning, everybody. Police have now charged a man over the notorious Easey Street murders, which saw two women stabbed to death in a frenzied attack in Melbourne almost 50 years ago. 65-year-old Perry Korumblis has been formally charged by Victoria Police with 2 counts of murder and 1 count of rape after being extradited from Italy. Police will allege the Greek-Australian dual citizen murdered 28-year-old Suzanne Armstrong and 27-year-old Susan Bartlett in their Collingwood home in 1977. He is also being accused of raping Armstrong.
Korumblis fronted court yesterday after being interviewed by detectives for several hours following his return to Australia. Now, he'll remain in custody until his next court date in February, where it will be decided whether his matter will proceed. Korumblis has always maintained his innocence. Family members of the two victims say they are ecstatic with the charges and they are hoping to finally get some closure. And we did deep dive this topic yesterday. We did a full explainer of the Easey Street murders and Perry Korumblis' extradition back to Australia. It's worth a listen. It's in your feed now.
Changing pace now, Australian primary schoolers have recorded their best ever results in a global maths and science test, bucking post-pandemic trends. Fresh analysis of the 2023 Trends in International Mathematics and Science study, which around 14,000 Aussie students sat, has given us a better picture of how the skills of our Year 4 and Year 8 students stack up globally. The reporting found Aussie Year 4 students ranked equal 5th out of 58 countries in science and equal 15th in mathematics. And that's a significant boost, Sash, from the results of the last test in 2019, where they ranked 9th and 23rd respectively.
Yeah, and with Year 8 kids, they ranked equal 8th in science out of the 44 countries, a slight drop from 7th in 2019. And for maths, they placed 9th, which was down from 7. Experts say the results reflect positively on teachers who have had to navigate a challenging post-pandemic educational environment. But, and this is a pretty big but, Chris, there was a notable gender gap between Aussie boys and girls in both subjects and age groups, with males outperforming females by as much as 20 points in some circumstances. And experts are sounding the alarm over this growing divide because there's been an increase in trying to get young girls, especially interested in STEM subjects and engaged and performing well. But despite those efforts, they're not actually coming through when we're seeing testing like this. So there's still a lot of work to do here in making sure that young girls are getting the same opportunities as boys when it comes to STEM subjects.
To politics now, the New South Wales Premier is set to be referred to the state's corruption watchdog. A parliamentary inquiry has been examining a development in Western Sydney, with Chris Minns' relationship with one of the key figures involved coming under scrutiny. The committee has voted to refer the Premier to the ICAC. Minns has responded, labelling the decision disgraceful and based on unsubstantiated allegations. In his statement, he's also criticised the committee of political point scoring with its decision to refer him.
Yeah, so some background on this. Now, this is in relation to a quite controversial redevelopment in Sydney of the Rosehill Racecourse, which was a racetrack for horses. The New South Wales government announced at this time last year that the racecourse would be torn down to make way for 25,000 new homes to reshape Sydney. This is such a big topic of conversation right across Australia, where we're trying to increase housing density. We're trying to address the housing crisis by building more. So it was sold to the people of Sydney as this great way to, increase housing density, but it involved ripping up the racecourse at the same time, which people were not happy with. Now, the decision to refer Minns to the ICAC is all around his relationship with Steve McMahon. Now, that man is head of government relations at the Australian Turf Club, which is the organisation that owns this site of Rosehill Racecourse. So Minns has publicly acknowledged that he's known McMahon for 20 years, and also in a budget estimates hearing, he didn't deny that McMahon came to him with the proposal. He didn't say he did, but he did not deny that he did not. Now, the quote from Min said, obviously, when you're in government, people come to you and say, look, we've got an idea. We think this would be good for our organisation. So Min's obviously not happy that this referral has happened. However, it's very serious to be investigated by the ICAC, and we'll have to wait and see how that plays out.
An update on what's going on in South Korea now. Moves are being made to impeach the president after yesterday's sudden call to bring in martial law. A recap, this whole saga lasted a grand total of 6 hours, President Yoon Suk-yeol making a shock address to the nation declaring martial law. Within hours, protesters descended on the National Assembly in Seoul, where MPs then voted 190 votes to 0 against the move, and the president conceded, withdrawing his plans to bring in the army to effectively run the country, Sash.
Yeah, and South Korea's main opposition, the Democratic Party, condemned Yoon's initial martial law declaration as insurrectionary behaviour and says it wants to charge him with crimes of rebellion. Now, Parliament will have to vote on whether to impeach Yoon by Saturday. So how this works, the vote has to happen within 72 hours of the motion being filed, which has happened. Now, if that vote passes, the president will immediately be suspended from office and the prime minister will become acting president. A trial then has to happen before the Constitutional Court. If 6 of the court's members vote to sustain the impeachment, the president will be removed from office. So quite a lot happening in South Korean politics. As you said, a 6-hour saga that now has very, very heavy and long implications for the president. It's worth noting as well, his defence minister has resigned, so has his chief of staff and a national security advisor.
And finally, the Matildas have managed a win in their friendly series, downing Taiwan 3-1 at Melbourne's Amy Park overnight.
One over the top for Yallop to chase. Riley Henry arriving at the back post. Looks for her, she slips and she scores!
That was the moment Briley Henry scored the Aussies' 3rd goal of the night on 10 after Tash Pryor and Sian Freya found the net earlier in the match. All 3 were making their debuts for the Tillies. And if you didn't watch the match, Sash, I highly recommend going back to watch that goal because, as you heard in the commentary there, she actually slipped, managed to catch herself just in time to header the ball into the goal. It was incredible.
Very cool. And you just said that all 3 of our goal scorers last night were making their debuts, and that's important because the side was without the likes of Steph Catley, Caitlin Ford, Kyra Cooney-Cross, Ellie Carpenter, Hayley Rasso, and Alana Kennedy, who all had to return to their club sides overseas. And, of course, we don't have Sam Kerr, Mary Fowler or Courtney Vine at the moment. They're all taking breaks for various reasons. So really cool to see this young team have a crack and get the win, 3-1. Really nice. And as well, they just come off 2 losses to Brazil. So very nice to get a win in this friendly series. Now we'll see Australia and Taiwan face off again this Saturday in Geelong, and that will wrap up the women's friendlies for 2024.
Yeah, and keeping with the Matildas fever, if last night wasn't enough and this friendly series is not enough, we do have a weekend briefing episode with Chloe Lagazzo and Emily Gilnick, so those 2 Matilda stars there. So if you want to have a listen to that, Antoinette chatted with them back in September, so it's a really fascinating chat that I absolutely loved listening to and highly recommend.
Fabulous. Chris, thank you for being here for the headlines. Next up, we are cracking into a deep dive on the deep state with Bension.
Hey, Bension here. The so-called deep state is this idea that members of government agencies, including military and intelligence agencies, are secretly working to undermine the agenda of the elected government. This is not just a shadowy conspiracy theory. Many senior officials who were in US President-elect Donald Trump's first administration have since said that they kept working for him so that they could be in the room to stop Trump from carrying out his worst impulses. On the right, these people are considered deep state traitors to their country. On the left, these people are considered heroes of the resistance. For his part, Trump has made it clear he won't tolerate it the second time around.
The departments and agencies that have been weaponized will be completely overhauled so that faceless bureaucrats will never again be able to target and persecute conservatives, Christians, or the left's political enemies, which they're doing now at a level that nobody can believe.
In Australia, things are a little different. The people spending the most time worrying about the deep state in this country also spend a lot of time worrying about 5G and vaccines. But within any government that employs hundreds of thousands of people, such as our federal government, the influence of powerful career bureaucrats can be hard to discern from the outside. So are the guardrails around Australia's government strong enough to resist it being undermined from within? And should bureaucrats act against a government if it's too extreme? David Andrews is a senior policy advisor at the National Security College of the Australian National University. David, welcome to the briefing.
Thanks very much for having me.
Does Australia have such a thing as a deep state?
People within government, appointed officials, maybe not acting to the full extent of the brief they've been given by the minister or the Prime Minister of the day. I think you could probably say there are cases of that or a possibility of that, but I wouldn't suggest that it's a systemic problem.
Without getting too deep into the technical weeds, how does the Australian government keep its departments in check?
So there's a principle of ministerial responsibility, which is that a minister is responsible for all the decisions and actions taken by their departments and agencies they're responsible for. And so then there's the impetus on the minister and on their office and their team to be across those details and to work hand in hand with a secretary or an agency head to understand what's going on and to, I guess, push them to achieve those outcomes. So the direction is given by a minister to be enacted by an agency head in their department. And so there is sort of an onus on the elected representative to ensure that that's being delivered to their satisfaction. And then that responsibility sort of trickles down from within departments and agencies. So a secretary or a director general, for example, has been given clear direction by a minister and they have to enact it. And if they don't, then there is the possibility of them being removed from that role and someone else being put in place who is going to deliver on that objective. So that's probably a very high-level sense, but you might say for individuals lower down the tree and just across the breadth of public sector decision-making, you also have bodies like the Australian Public Service Commission, who sits across the wide sweep of the federal public service and has things like a code of conduct that all employees are meant to abide by, which sets out some of those principles and provides a framework against which you can be deemed to have not met and therefore be eligible to be removed from duties. Beyond that, we do see the regular political theatre of Senate estimates is one example, which is a process whereby committees made up of senators can call members of public agencies to report to them on a regular basis and sort of sit there and be grilled by the senators effectively. And that is a way of bringing some of those discussions which might occur between an agency and a minister, like to keep them slightly out of the public eye. It means they're brought forward and the opposition and independents who may be on these committees can quiz you as well.
One of the ways in which I guess people are confident in democratically elected governments and the agencies under them is this notion of transparency and accountability. If you can see it, then there's accountability and there's consequences if people do the wrong thing. But necessarily, some of our agencies in Australia have to do a lot of their work in secret, Australia's intelligence agencies in particular. How does the government and the parliament make sure that those agencies don't abuse their power?
I think that's a really important clarification because, of course, as citizens and as taxpayers, we all have an interest that public policy has been conducted sensibly, safely, by the book, by the rules. But there are some things which necessarily can't be made fully transparent at all times, because either it puts individuals at risk in the case of intelligence operations, for example, or because there are complex negotiations that are ongoing that would be impossible to conduct if all the details were out there from minute one. And so that is one of the responsibilities of these committees. So one example would be the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, which is actually, it operates in a closed-door fashion. But still within that, it's a bipartisan government and opposition committee of parliamentarians who can quiz intelligence heads, directors general, sort of key personnel in those agencies, and hold them to account in that context. So it's reading in members of the opposition as well as governments. They can understand what's going on, and it's not just being reserved to the government of the day. You also have people like the Independent National Security Legislation Monitor, who is what the name suggests, is that they are an independent appointed individual, a monitor, who can review national security legislation and ensure that it is fit for purpose and that it's meeting the right sort of legal standards and ethical standards. It's a difficult line to draw sometimes because of that necessary secrecy, but governments are certainly aware of that and then will, as best they can, report publicly on the findings of those reviews to keep people informed.
In the US, on the left, the same people who are described as members of the deep state by the right are considered kind of heroes in the sense that they supposedly stopped Donald Trump doing some of the worst or most extreme things that he might have wanted to do in his first presidency. Is there ever a role for public servants in constraining an elected government from the inside?
That is a very difficult philosophical and legal question, but a very good one all the same. I think it's worth drawing some distinctions between the US system and the Australian system. I guess in the US case, the distinction might be that a number of the laws or the directions that were given were not actually found to be legal, or at least they were not assessed to be legal by those decision makers. So it wasn't that they were going outside of a process to find a way to prevent these actions from taking place, but they were, by their assessment, and I think was upheld by the courts, were found to actually be taking legal actions to not obey an illegal order. But it's a hugely complicated process, which I think often boils down to individuals as much as systems.
And finally, we're expecting a federal election in early 2025. Given that the system no longer prevents a Prime Minister from changing over the very senior heads of agencies, are there public servants whose values might not align with Peter Dutton's who could expect to lose their job if he's elected?
It is entirely conceivable that there'll be people who will either choose to resign or will be removed from their role. It could be for all kinds of reasons. Because the relationship between a minister and a secretary is actually vital to the functioning of that department, there could also just be simple personality clashes that have nothing to do with policy. But if you have to work hand in hand to deliver that platform, and if you can't gel with that individual, or you might have some trust issues in the past or what have you, that could, at one level, make sense, the reason to ask someone to move on. It has definitely happened in the past, and so I think it would be reasonable to expect it might happen again. But I think people who might feel compromised or at risk, perhaps, depending on that relationship, I would expect that they may well elect to resign rather than compel a government to remove them.
Well, David Andrews, this has been absolutely fascinating. Thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing.
My pleasure. Thanks so much.
Senior Policy Advisor at ANU's National Security College, David Andrews there. That's it for this episode of The Briefing. Thanks for listening. We'd love it if you could share this ep with someone you think might enjoy it. Meantime, check us out on Instagram. We're at The Briefing Podcast, and on TikTok and YouTube, just search Listener Newsroom. We'll be back in your feed this afternoon from 3. I'm Bension Siebert. Catch you next time.
Listener.